Meeting of the City of Ann Arbor's Environmental Commission at 7:02. Emily, will you please call roll?
Sure. Vice Chair Skinner,
Here.
Commissioner Needham,
Here.
Councilmember Smith,
Present.
Commissioner Mursky,
Here.
Commissioner Appel.
Here.
Fantastic
Well
timing.
timed.
Commissioner Gibrandal,
Here.
Councilmember Bannister,
Here.
Chair Hutton,
Here.
Commissioner Rigo,
Here.
and Commissioner Coward.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. We have before us a draft of tonight's agenda. Are there any additions or corrections that need to be made to it? Is there a motion to approve the agenda? Commissioner
So
Skinner
moved.
is a second. Commissioner Mursky, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, the agenda is approved. We also have a draft of the minutes from the April meeting. Are there any questions or corrections about the meeting notes? Yeah, these went up a little bit later.
Did they go out?
They went out last month.
Last month? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Are we still reviewing, or are you waiting for me? Is there a motion to approve the April minutes? Commissioner Skinner? Commissioner Gibrandal, a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, the April minutes stand approved. And I am happy to report that City Council has reappointed Commissioner Skinner and Commissioner Graham, and I'm delighted to welcome a new commissioner to us, Dr. John Kellwart. Welcome to Commissioner, we're really glad
Thank
that
you.
you're here. Would you mind taking a couple minutes and just telling us about yourself and?
Sure, yeah. So my name's John Kellwart. I've lived in Ann Arbor altogether for about 15 years, most recently for the past 11 years. First initially came to Ann Arbor to do doctoral studies at what was the School for Natural Resources and Environment, and then came back to Ann Arbor in 2007. Worked at the Graham Sustainability Institute at the university for the past 9 years, leading a variety of multidisciplinary research projects and some student programs. And for the past 6 months, I've been at the College of Engineering at the university, and I live in Northeast Ann Arbor.
Excellent. Well, welcome, we're really glad that you are
Thanks.
joining us. And I just got word that Veronica Hanna is going to be resigning her position, so we will have another opening. But now that the commission is almost fully seated, it makes sense for us to have elections. And I sent out an email late, which is consistent for the reason that I'm saying that I would like to step down as chair. I'm going to remain on the commission, but my job has changed and I don't feel like I have the time to devote as thoroughly as I need to this position. So I would like to step down, and I would like to have other people step up. And in that spirit, I would like to open up the nominations for Chair of the Environmental Commission. And I would nominate Bob Needham.
Second that nomination, assuming you're willing to take on that.
I am. May live to regret it, but we'll see.
Are there other nominations? Okay. If there are no further nominations, then the nominations for the Chair of the Environmental Commission are closed. All those in favor of Bob Needham as the Chair of the Environmental Commission, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Congratulations, Bob.
Thank you.
And now I think that we need to change places,
Yeah.
because you're now the Chair.
That was
Yeah.
I warned him that I thought it would have to happen, but I looked up the rules,
I think that's correct.
and that's how it works. Got the seat from Bob.
You're never right.
You don't have to wait till January 20th or something like that.
Right.
Welcome to the chief seat.
Did you brush up on Robert's rules?
I know.
I did not.
Well, that's okay. My understanding is so low that you have a low bar. Welcome to.
Thanks, everyone, and I do want to thank Susan in particular on behalf of myself, and I think everyone on the commission for just an outstanding term as chairperson. I
Thanks.
can't imagine living up to your standards, but I'll try.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And thanks for letting me serve. I really enjoyed it.
So I guess our next order of business is open nominations for vice chair. Do I hear any nominations for that?
I would nominate the current vice chair to continue serving in that position if she is so willing.
Second.
Great. Any others? All those in favor of Commissioner Skinner as vice chair?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Welcome back.
Glad I don't have to change seats. It's the only reason I'm doing it. I don't have to do it tonight.
Our next order of business is public commentary. Does anyone in the audience wish to speak to the commission tonight? Come right up front here. You have 3 minutes and the lights will tell you how you're doing as far as time. Could you start with your name?
My name is James Cornell Wilson III, the son of William. I came across some new information, trying to find myself and find my history and things like that. All right. Columbus did not discover America. Everybody know that. I wasn't taught that in high school. This was a big whoop for me. You all right? Blew my mind. He didn't discover America. Now I hear all this hoopla about everybody saying this and this, and people on Facebook, YouTube, and everything. It went kind of crazy on the matter. And I'm seeing, it troubles my soul. So I have to say something because my soul is troubled. I cannot rest. Okay. Since Columbus did not discover America, by proper definition, that makes every black person in America the American African, not the African American. That's the proper definition. Okay. All right. That being said, since we have beat Columbus over here, we have beat colonialism. All right, I'm trying to be fast as probably. If we beat colonialism, that means I am indigenous. That means if I am indigenous, and y'all recognize me as James Cornell Wilson III, that means I am alive. I live. I am not part of a corporation. I'm a living entity. That being said, I'd like to challenge Donald Trump for president of the United States. That sound crazy, but I'm the Mad Hatter. I can be crazy. I'd like to challenge him on that. Now, if I can get y'all assistance on that, I would greatly appreciate it. But everything that I told you is factual, and it is true. And I don't want to be self-proclaimed because my family already said, yeah, you'll make a good president. So it's unanimous as far as I'm concerned. But this is about my people. And they don't know who they are. They still believe in Christianity, and that's not their root belief. That's not their root spirituality system. This must be returned to them. Summer camps can do that. Teach them of native history and native culture. Instead of teaching them about Egypt, we done found no pyramids over here, teach them about those things. Because my sons are getting older, they got to have something to look up to. They got to look up to the pride of Asante Shantawan. They got to look up the pride of the natives, the Jaguars. They got to look up to these guys because they just can't look at slavery. They just can't be the end-all, be-all to a great civilization. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
Anyone else like to address the commission? Okay, moving on. New business. We have, I believe, a presentation this evening from Paul Steen of the Huron River Watershed Council on water quality metrics. Thank you for coming, Paul.
Thanks for having me. I don't think this will take too long. It's not an overly long or overly complicated presentation. Do I have more than 3 minutes? though?
Yes.
Okay. Making sure.
No beeping.
These meetings are new to me.
Air conditioning is way better here than at my house, so take all.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about scoring watershed health. And specifically, what brought me to this meeting tonight was back in February, Matt Nod reached out to my boss, Laura Rubin, said, we're interested in developing some kind of system to help us put our data together for public consumption. And she responded by saying, we've done something very similar. So I sent Matt what we had been working on up to that point in terms of summarizing ecological health. And Matt ran that by a couple other commission members. They looked at it, couldn't really figure it out. Called our office, and I couldn't remember how I did it because by that point it was a few months back. So we're like, well, let's get you into this meeting, and then it gave me time to think about, oh yeah, that's how I did it, and put it together again, so I can properly explain it to John and the others, and possibly then have this as a tool that the city can use in showing off their own environmental data. Okay, so that's why I'm here. So the Huron River watershed, which we live in. So this is a map of such, with all the creeks divided up into their own little land groups. We call them creek sheds. Then I'm just going to kind of jump ahead and say this is what the end product looks like in this process. Just so and then I'm going to talk from there. I'm going to talk about, okay, how do we get to that end product? And then after I do that, going to say, okay, let's look at Ann Arbor specifically, and go right down to the Ann Arbor borders. So across the whole watershed, this process puts all of our environmental data into a single scale, ranging from 0, extremely disturbed, to 100. It's giving that number to each one of these individual creek sheds. Okay? So just as an example, across the watershed, this is what you end up with. Up in Pinckney, we have a ecosystem that's nearly pristine in terms of, all of this, by the way, is based on the effects on water. So there's some land aspects involved, but it's all about what's the ultimate impact on the water. So Honey Creek up in Pinckney, really, really, really high quality river. And then you can see Mill Creek, not as much, and it goes down. Brighton, South Lower Creek in Brighton has a lot of phosphorus issues, and a lot of habitat issues and temperature issues there, so that kind of drops it down. And then Traver Creek, the best of the Ann Arbor creeks, and then going all the way down to the very bottom, Allen's Creek, which is basically a pipe. It probably can't even really be called a creek. So that kind of gives you the sense of the overall, anywhere running from a pipe, Allen's Creek, up to a really natural stream. And so that's what this kind of visualization tool is meant to show. So how do we come up with this? We take a bunch of different metrics. Land use, land cover, that involves impervious surface, natural areas, stream flow, and so on down. And I say, why these metrics? And then they're opportunistic, but also mechanistic. Opportunistic as in, this is the information that the Huron River Watershed Council has, either stuff we've collected over time or publicly available GIS layers. That's like for number 1 and number 2. So it's opportunistic. This is the data we have on hand. It's also mechanistic, meaning these are also through research and experience in the ecological science. A lot of these are considered to be, the prime things that really affect a stream. So it doesn't have everything. We can never get everything into, we just simply can't collect that amount of data. But what the Watershed Council has tried to do is collect the biggest things that affect the stream and put them into this tool. Okay, so these 12 metrics, that's where those scores come from. Each metric is given a letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, and those correspond roughly to what we were looking at on that thermometer with pristine is an A, healthy but impacted is a B, and so on. So for all 12 of those metrics, you score them, you add up those scores. So if you have a creek that is perfect and it gets an A in every single one of those metrics, really pristine, perfect creek, that brings you to a 48, which of course, a scale of 0 to 48 is totally doesn't make sense to anyone's head, right? So we just put a scaling factor in there. You multiply 48 by 2.083, and you extend that scale from 0 to 100. So suddenly you put this on a scale that intuitively makes sense to people. Okay, so we're scoring all those metrics on this. And then, of course, this is an important point here. How do you decide if a parameter is A, B, C, D, or F? Now, one thing that should be brought up is that all these parameters they inherently have to be scored differently because they are inherently different from each other. There's different units. We're talking about fish and communities, and we're talking about phosphorus. So entirely different things. So that's why we kind of we scrub away the actual numbers and turn it into more of this letter grade. And that could be the kind of thing that Ann Arbor looks at too, all this disparate data. How do you put this all in one tool together? Well, you have to kind of scrub away some of the actual numbers and make it more categorical. It makes it more generic. For some of these, it's pretty easy to decide this letter grade. For like E. coli, for example, phosphorus, there's actual state requirements, state standards. So with that, it's easy to see when something passes and fails. Just in terms of like an example, E. coli, if a stream is really low E. coli counts and has never passed that state established threshold, that's an A. If it's every time we've sampled, it far exceeds the E. coli threshold, that makes it an F. And then so it gives you kind of boundaries, and then you find your way in between for all the in-between values. For macroinvertebrates, is there a reference point? So this kind of really works the same way. There's a creek up in Oakland County that's really pristine, has 25 insect families, which is really good. If you look all around the state, if you have 25 insect families, it's considered a very nice place. And then, so we have an upper end, so that's our A. And then our lower end, the worst place we have around here in the Huron is Swift Run, where you can go there and maybe only find 3 insects total. One family, just 3 insects, like hardly anything living there. So you have your A and your F, and then that helps you kind of get in the outer ends of the scale, and then it helps you decide in between how you're going to rank other streams too. And sometimes it just honestly comes down to professional judgment, like with dams. There's so many possible things you can measure with a dam, so many impacts. So in that case, we look at a system, we look at the number of dams, we look at how big the dam is, we look at the impact of that dam on water flow or temperature, or the fish community or the insect community, and Huron, not just me, but the rest of the Huron River Watershed Council, okay, we'll give that a grade based on what we deem its impact to be. So a stream that had no dams on it, that would be an A. The Huron River as it flows through Ann Arbor, that's an F. It's just about every aspect of the Huron River has changed because of the dams that are on the main branch of the Huron. So that's kind of where the score comes from. It takes all these different pieces of data that all have different units, different meanings, and puts them together in this tool. Do you have missing data? Yes, you're always going to have missing data. We have some places like in Oakland County where we have no phosphorus information. So if it's an option of just not even just leaving out that whole area entirely, or just kind of overlooking the fact that you have missing data. We choose to overlook it. It just means that the tool isn't always as accurate in some areas as it is in others. So if you have 12 parameters, you have this one scaling that you can do to make it between a 0 and a 100 score. Let's say you only have 10 parameters. Then you just use a different scaling factor. It still gives you, and then that would still give you a range between 0 and 100. Obviously, that can be abused, so you wouldn't want to base everything on a large scale based on one or two variables. But you got to get some data, but you can't hold up your whole analysis just for missing a piece here and there. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's look at Ann Arbor. I cut those creek sheds according to the boundaries of the city. And these are the different creek sheds that are in Ann Arbor. Bring up their numbers and the name of the creek. So for example, Allen's, that's basically just the storm drain under the main downtown area. This gets a score of 5 on a scale of 0 to 100. And the only reason it's not a 0 is because the water that comes out of there is really cold. So actually that's typically good for aquatic life. And so it gets an A. So Allen's Creek gets an A for water temperature, which makes sense. It never sees the sunlight, right? So, but pretty much everything else coming out of Allen's Creek is really bad in terms of ecological health. And then on the other hand, you have just a sliver of Fleming Creek in Ann Arbor. So Fleming Creek gets a 73 on this scale. Traver is kind of what I would say it's the best Ann Arbor, self-contained Ann Arbor stream. Like there's a little bit that's out into the township, but most of Traver is right here in the city. Mallett's Creek isn't too far off. Mallett's Creek, now we haven't backtracked this historically, but Mallett's Creek has really improved a lot, like within the last 5 years. So if we were to backtrack this historically, that number probably would be quite a bit lower. And then Swift Run and Miller's really impacted streams where many times there's barely water flowing through those streams at all. So that's kind of the breakdown of how, and then you can see so it gives you a sense, if you look at it at this scale, in terms of the creeks, what are good creeks, what are the places that maybe we want to concentrate on the most. It's a visualization tool. It's not meant to predict things. It's meant to give us a quick look at all of our information. So it's not a model. It's not a model, right? It's meant to drive management action. You could, if you just wanted a single score for all of Ann Arbor, it's really easy. You just take a weighted average based on the individual creek shed size. And you can see, like, for example, the Huron, that refers to both the river and the direct drainage that goes into the Huron is 30% of Ann Arbor. Mallett's Creek is 30% of Ann Arbor. So you can take a weighted average based on those creek shed sizes, and overall you end up with a score of 30 for Ann Arbor streams. So, somewhere between moderately disturbed and heavily disturbed, leaning on the heavy side. So it's a concept that could be transferable to what the city wants to do. Now, I don't know precisely what the city wants to do because I haven't been in those conversations, but you can alter a lot of the aspects of this to make it work for you. You can track this over time so you can see if your scores are improving. You can use other metrics, definitely. Like, these are all very water-focused metrics, but you might have metrics that are really land quality or pollution, or so there's other things that you could put in here. There's other geographic areas. The Watershed Council always tends to look at things based on the creek, but you could look at neighborhoods or wards or whatever geographic area you wanted. You could weight metrics differently. You might want impervious surface to count 3 times more than any other metric. So, it's just up to the person doing it. Because the goal is to reflect reality. So, you can't get, this tool is meant to serve you, so if a tool doesn't reflect reality, you alter the tool so it reflects reality. Probably would make more sense for the Watershed Council to go back and look at that list of metrics and say, now which one of these is the most important? Which one of these really drives things? And think about weighting it. We just haven't gotten to that point yet, but it would be probably an interesting practice to see what would come from that. All right, so quick and easy. Like I said, any questions?
How often are you updating the scores?
We're updating them as certainly no more than a year, every year. At the end of the year, we put all, we really compile all of our field information. In terms of, well, I should say theoretically, that's what we'd want to do, but this is very new, so we haven't really gotten to that point yet.
Wouldn't you need to test at different times of the year? Because I would assume you would learn more in certain seasons.
Right, well, and so I suppose we kind of look at it as at a year window, saying this is the overall average for a year. Now, if our data was specific enough, you certainly could break it down into seasons. It's just that's a lot of information that we don't have. I do that for the macroinvertebrates because we sample 3 seasons a year. I can do that like specifically for the bugs, but we can't necessarily do that for E. coli when we only sample in the summer. So it kind of just depends on what your parameter is. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Someone else?
Do you work at all with the city's stormwater model as a way to predict how the quality and the health of the watershed?
Right. I don't personally, but Rick does all the storm. I don't know if you guys know Rick Lawson. He's the one that heads up the Middle Huron group. I'm sure he does, but I'm not familiar enough with his day-to-day, so.
Okay, all right.
Sorry. Yeah, Mike.
As you look at it on city scale, I'm wondering if including Newport Creek would also give us more information, particularly on the north side of town. And,
so I'm not even familiar. Is that like go to the Raisin or?
No, it flows into the Huron. It's sort of just general mainstream of the Huron.
Right.
Yeah, there's like a little blue line there.
Right, so that has gotten absorbed into the larger Huron section.
Okay.
Certainly, if we had specific data on it, that could totally be broken off into its own area, but we don't. So in our example, we can't do it because we don't have the information, but there's no reason why another effort, couldn't do that. Yeah, a lot of the tiniest, like first order tributaries, they don't get directly sampled.
I was wondering if you've looked at other watershed associations and how they've addressed this issue. It sounds like you put this together based on Huron, which is
Right.
great, but I'm wondering how this compares to other metrics.
I haven't seen other groups do this.
Okay, I've seen lake associations do them. I don't know about river, settings.
Right, yeah. I just haven't seen anyone else do it. I can't say it's my own idea. I've probably picked it up from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that complicated of a thing. I probably learned it in school and then forgot where I learned it.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as seeing other people present on it, I haven't.
Okay.
So.
And then the other question I had, first a comment. I appreciate your point on weighting certain things, like land cover being a driver of several of the other factors rather than kind of equalizing everything.
Right.
But wondered about not estimating for values that you don't have and just leaving those out, but still calculating a score. I think that probably skews things in a way that's more positive than we think.
I guess
I'm
it
guessing.
depends on what metric is left out, right?
Mhm.
Like, we don't have good fish data. And as you go farther north, you're probably going to have better and better fish communities. It's just more rural, more
Mhm.
natural. So if you leave that out, it will pull the scores down, that kind of thing. It's not really an issue in Ann Arbor. Pretty much we have all of the information. Just, the more populated it is, it seems like the more data we have.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you have to have some kind of correction there, because you can't just leave it out entirely. I mean, basically, that's what I'm doing. I am leaving it out entirely and then just adjusting the scoring mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of get at your question?
It's just, without kind of crunching the numbers, it's hard to say what the impact on it is, but I worry about just kind of leaving it out rather than kind of estimating or kind of imputing a value.
Right, so, like.
If you're gonna be comparing.
In some cases, we have given estimates to fill that missing data gap. But some places, we just don't know. I mean, I suppose you could make models from the other, you could create all kinds of models that give predictions. And maybe that's a future step, but it's not something we can do yet.
Yep. And then just two other kind of thoughts about this in terms of, kind of looking at a good set of ecological factors, but thinking about other factors, like social factors, like access, as one thing that could be looked at in terms of an overall stream system.
Yeah.
And the other one I was wondering about if you gave any thought to like historical contamination sites.
Right.
And
that would be a great one to get on here. I would love to have, so we have like, in terms of chemical contamination, we don't have much.
Right.
And it's not something the Watershed Council has actively sampled ourselves, so we just don't have that information. But it's becoming more and more of an issue. You know? So it would be a good thing to think about. It's extremely expensive, so it goes beyond our capacity.
well, even
It's
just
something that we could think about monitoring.
I guess I was thinking like, EPA's areas of concern, finding the equivalent for this in terms of just where are the sites, not necessarily kind of quantifying it anyway.
Right.
Other than we know there's 3 areas of potential contamination within this watershed versus the other one. Because the testing that would be required, you'd have to know what the contaminants were in the first place, which you don't always know.
Right. Okay, well, that's a good point.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
You had mentioned that some of the scores had changed a little bit over time, and I'm just wondering what you have seen in terms of moving the needle. Which categories are things that we could actually have an impact on? There's some things it's like, what do you do? And then there's some things where we actually could. Having looked at all these metrics, where do you feel like we have the most potential to be able to raise these scores in ways that we can actually have some control over?
Yeah, good question. For example, impervious surface changes on the scale of decades, so you can't just set this up at a yearly analysis and expect to see that score change at all. Things we have directly seen in Mallett's Creek, for example, the macroinvertebrate community is definitely getting better over time. We have a significant increase of the number of insect families that live there. A lot of that happened a couple of years after the county did a ton of work in stream restoration with habitat. I guess in that case, so habitat has increased, the macroinvertebrate community has increased. I know we've seen phosphorus declines and E. coli declines in mallets, and this is happening on the time scale of years. So we can detect that. Dam impact certainly could be very quickly. Quickly is the wrong word. If a dam got taken out, that would change the score immediately. Natural areas, this particular metric is scored on looking at like the total number of natural forests and wetlands, and at the same time considering the amount of lands that have been officially protected, either put in parkland or easements. The more the land is protected, the higher that score gets. That's something that would certainly change on a pretty quick scale. We see conservation easements being put in all the time. So Right. Yeah, that kind of, I mean, so land use, land cover, impervious surface, that's the stuff that happens on a decade scale, but the rest of these actually, I think they happen pretty quickly.
The one other extension of that, and so looking at impervious surface is one thing, but anything built after a certain date is being controlled through stormwater management and things like that. So it's not necessarily equal opportunity.
Right.
So that may be another way to kind of break things out,
Right.
because areas, creeks, in this zone that were developed later, even though they may have the same impervious surface as Allen's Creek, the water quality is probably better because they're going through some system prior to getting to the creek. So that would be another way to sort of break down that whole impervious number into something that's a little bit more finely understood.
Yeah, I mean, really,
with some
that
of
could be its own measurable.
Right.
That you put in there.
Right, because all of those facilities are trackable from the city and the county. Those are all public record.
Right.
And so that might be something that would be interesting to work through Rick Lawson's work, to be able to fine tune that number a little bit too.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Right, that's good.
Yeah, I thought it might be helpful to remind commission and also for the public's benefit to put this in the context of meetings and discussions that we had going back about a year ago, where we looked at the sustainability framework and the goal areas and the indicators that are posted on the dashboard that the city has. And most of you hopefully remember that we had a metric subcommittee that looked at metrics, including this one, and tried to identify where we could make improvements to the metrics. So if you looked at the old dashboard, there was a metric for the creek shed, but it was a snapshot metric. It wasn't anything that could be trended, and it wasn't anything that we could do, like Commissioner Gabrandel said, where we could say, if we did X based on, bang for the buck, we have a certain amount of money to spend, what could we do? That would improve these creek sheds and improve a rating, and we would see then the score jump from 30 to 33 or whatever the case might be. And so that is what led to the development of the whole tracking and metric process that Huron River Watershed Council developed and Paul's presented. My sense is that what we want to do with this is just like we have with the climate action plan. We have something that says we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's not something also that you can do tomorrow and see that the greenhouse gas emissions went down 25% because of one action that we did. We have goals going out to 2050. And it seems to me that the city should be working with the council to continue to improve this metric, as was discussed today, looking at some of the weights, seeing if some of the weights should be different, but then specifically getting this out in the public domain and saying, hey folks, you may think that the watershed here in Ann Arbor is pretty good, but actually the weighted average is only 30. I was down at Gallup Park today, and there were a lot of people that were paddling, that were tubing, that were wading in the river and things like that. It's a huge potential asset, and if we could make it healthier, I think it would be good for the city. So hopefully what we will do with this is we will post it on the dashboard and show that our first entry is we rate 30 out of 100. And then what I would like to see us do as a commission working with the council is to do exactly what you described and say, what are the things that we can leverage between our resources, if you will, and the councils and other kinds of stakeholders that we have, that are, that we can engage, so that we can get from 30 to 35 and 35 to 40, and maybe we set then some specific goals that say by, I'm gonna pull a number out of the air again, 2050, take it to like the climate action plan, and by 2050, we would like the watershed rating to be 60. And then we start to look at actions to drive that up, point by point, up to 60. And we have maybe intermediate targets, again, just like we have with the climate action plan and the greenhouse gas reductions. And hopefully, we can use this as a tool for awareness and for guiding our actions so that we do those in a responsible way to see improvements in the health of the watershed. And I think we can also go backwards if we decide that land use and land cover is something that should be more heavily weighted, and we decide that 3 years from now, there's no problem with going back and taking the old 30 and reweighting that with a new weight factor for land use and land cover compared to E. coli or something else. And so we can continue to optimize this together with the council as we get smarter and as we have more resources to take the kind of data that we need to be able to have data for all 12, for all the watersheds, and weight them appropriately. So I hope that's something that we can do, and I think maybe we don't do it today, but it's something that we engage the Watershed Council on, and saying what would be realistic goals and what would be realistic actions tied to those goals that we could then start to work with all stakeholders to start to achieve them, make that kind of improvement.
Well, the Watershed Council will definitely be a willing participant, happy to be a good partner. So, yeah, I think it sounds like a great project.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good for the council to be able to say, not only for Ann Arbor, but for the watershed as a whole, the overall rating is X, and everybody is gonna understand X, whereas the ratings that we had before were some qualitative conglomeration of all these different 12 factors. I don't even know how we got to the ratings that are currently published on the dashboard. They're sort of meaningless, I think. And now everybody will be able to understand this and be able to trace it back to how it was calculated and what the data is for each particular sub-metric, if you will.
John, I would add that there's no water quality metric on the dashboard.
There used to be. I don't know if there is now.
Right, there isn't now.
There isn't. It's been removed. Yeah. Okay. So there used to be 2 years ago.
So at the very least, I think that this data needs to see the light of day so that people understand the impacts of human activity on the watershed.
Yes.
So that they can measure the different things that you're considering as far as developing this methodology. And we need a simple way to indicate whether we're making progress or not. But I think that the very first step is we got to get this stuff up there and establish our baseline. Here's where we are right now.
Yes.
I mean, at this point, it's still really baby steps, and thankfully we do have the Watershed Council to work on monitoring, work on the data analysis, because obviously, we don't have the fleet of volunteers to go out and do the stream monitoring and testing and data gathering that's necessary to be able to do all this stuff.
But by maybe just publicizing it more people will be willing to step forward and do that on a volunteer basis.
Yeah, I don't think we have any shortage of people that are willing to do this work. We just have to talk about the fact that we want this information.
Yes. And I think if you look at, you take Ann Arbor and you take away the river and the watershed and you plunk Ann Arbor in the middle of whatever, the middle of the state of Michigan and eliminate that feature, it would dramatically change the character of the city. I mean, just think of the parks that we have and all the activities, and you look at the DTE site that's going to be developed on the riverbanks. I mean, these are huge assets for the city, and if the quality of the watershed is 30, I think we can get a lot of people to say, hey, we're on board to raising this and improve the value of the features that relate to the watershed.
And just a couple other quick questions. In addition to the 12 metrics that you do have, if there, what one or two others that you don't have would you most like to have? Would it be chemical contamination?
Right, I really like John's comment about contamination sites. That's great. Just, I mean, with PFAS issues and the Gelman plume, and it's like
Right.
all this stuff that we haven't that the Watershed Council hasn't historically monitored, but others have. It'd be great to pull in that data, find those data sources, and make something of it.
So there are some sources for that?
Well, there's an EPA site or an EPA data layer that has the contamination sites. Some of that other stuff probably doesn't exist yet.
You said that testing the water itself for contamination would be horribly expensive.
Oh yeah, I looked into it last year. It's multiple thousands for a water sample, you know, and a sediment sample, and you'd have to do that everywhere. So, you know, that's kind of why we do macroinvertebrates in the first place. It's because it's meant to be, it's meant to reflect that,
Yeah.
but done extremely cheaply. Yeah, I guess the other one I would personally love to have would be mussels, and that's just that's kind of on par with macroinvertebrates and fish. It's, you know, other things that live in the water. What could we say about them? Which the Watershed Council does have more of a possibility of jumping into other monitoring of other living organisms, because that's easier and cheaper. But I haven't been able to get a grant on that one yet.
Gotcha. Any other questions?
I had one just to follow up on John's about the swimming and the boating and everything. And I know, I think if I understand correctly, people aren't supposed to be submerged in the water, and we don't post anything about whether it's dangerous in the water today or not, or whether there's a
Right.
spill from the hospital waste in the water or anything like this. And so, but should we, they aren't submerged supposedly, but when they're on the tubes, even with the floor in the tube, you know, they're falling out of
Right.
the. And
Yeah. So I can speak to that, because that's a normal marketing point of the Watershed Council. So if the city wanted to take it and do something with it, that'd be great. Basically, as long as it hasn't rained for about 2 days, the Huron River is totally fine to completely submerge in. I swim in it all the time. Because it takes about that long for the river to process any kind of contamination. The contamination settles out, goes downstream. The E. coli, you know, it breaks down. Because of that, it doesn't really make sense to put up signs and take signs down constantly. So you just kind of have to get people aware of that rule of thumb. You know, wait 48 hours and go in. And some of the smaller creeks probably you shouldn't go in at all, but people aren't doing that on a regular basis. You know, the only people doing that are my interns, right? So like some of the smaller creeks can have E. coli levels above the, well, there isn't technically a state standard for it, but the recommended standard, you know, just all the time, it's always high in E. coli. Swift run and mallets and a lot of, you know, because they're constantly pulling, you know, dog feces and raccoon feces just all the time coming into the creek. So, but you know, but people aren't going into those. It's really just the Huron, and the Huron has so much water flow coming from upstream that it's able to process all that stuff pretty quickly. Does that make sense?
Yes, that
so
makes
really,
sense.
it can be all that can be summarized down into a single sentence. So, and the Watershed Council is always trying to spread that word. You know, wait 48 hours and you're fine.
Yes. Well, and even, I would support even a small little sign, you know, at like the canoe liveries and the rowing club that was just the one where you could move the numbers or whatnot, whether it's safe to be out
Right.
submerged.
Right.
But currently, I think all the signs say no swimming.
Yeah, see, it's just not true. It's probably just, I mean, you guys would know better than me, a liability issue. I don't know.
Something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One last little point. The idea of a beach on the Huron River has been thrown around. I know Council Member Westfall has proposed it. I picked up the idea and have shared it with a couple of other people. And, you know, that goes exactly to this point. I mean, if you go down on a hot summer day, it's not only people that are in the river and paddling, there's a lot of people that are just outside, and it would be a nice feature, at least I think it would be, maybe other people don't. But that would be just one more way of using the watershed health to get us to the point where we could say, yes, we could put a beach. We actually had an email exchange with Laura Rubin on this. She said if we were to do that, it would probably want to be north or upstream of where Allen Creek terminates into the river. But, you know, that would be another thing that would be a nice addition to Ann Arbor, and we would then want to have that obviously be clean and not have to necessarily move numbers and things around back and forth on a rainy day versus one that was the day before, and just say, hey, it's safe to use this beach, and it's a wonderful feature.
I mean, yeah, realistically, you would certainly be having a Department of Health checking it regularly,
Yeah.
but just like any other beach in Michigan,
True.
right? They can have closures. So,
Yeah.
But yeah.
Along that vein, for a long time, my office is up the hill from the Cascades, and it's just been enormous. The response has been enormous, and I think that we have a massive opportunity at these targeted spots where we could be doing so much education for people that are standing around waiting in line to get a tube.
Great point.
Just captive audience sitting there looking at their phone. And I feel like we can post all this stuff on our website, and that's all great. I'm completely in support of that. But I also feel like there's just these spots around, like Gallup, like the Cascades, like where this dock, where the rowers are, but frankly is becoming like a massive zone for people to sunbathe and get in the water, that we could really leverage so much public education about wait 48 hours, or here's things you can do in your yard that's going to help our river, and if you're putting your body in it, you may be more likely to actually do that. So I feel like there's some real opportunities for like relatively moderate cost to be able to get word out in a way that maybe is different than a flyer that goes out in your mail, but is, people that are hanging around and have a vested interest in understanding that what is on their skin is healthy and that their direct actions in their lives affect that too. So I just think that would be, it's ever since the Cascades explosion, and I've just watched so many people standing for so long, and it's like, why are we not taking advantage of this? So this feels like something that we could maybe partner with parks, or I know a lot of that area is being redone down in there because there's a lot of funny conflicts now because of the explosion of what's happened, which is wonderful. I mean, it's great. I'm not against it at all, but I think we have some opportunities that maybe we could help drive or influence to be able to make some of those things happen, so people can understand what the impact that they have and little things that they can do to be able to increase the health of the river and change the metric.
If I can piggyback on that, we need to find an Eagle Scout to put up a bulletin board and take a plastic laminated version of your one slide that shows the overall health and put that up there with a couple of summary comments, and there you have it. I mean, it's right there.
Right.
Just do that once a year, laminate a printout and post it, and now people understand a lot more than they ever did before, for sure. And that's a lot better than burying it on a website.
Right.
15 clicks down.
Right.
Anything else?
Thanks a lot for your time. I
Yeah,
really
thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much. I appreciate all the positive feedback. It was great. So thanks for having me. Close this for you.
Do we have any committee reports? No, a couple of our committee chairs are not here this evening. Report Reports from other commissions, anything from Parks, Mike?
Canceled last month.
Planning?
Just more medical marijuana, so doing 6 or 7 every time, I'd say. So that's really been taking up the vast majority, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of relationship to this body, so I won't bore you with the details of that.
Energy?
So we had a work session, our last meeting, but I think it's worth mentioning a couple things. First of all, we've formed an ordinance subcommittee, and the subcommittee is working right now on 2 particular ordinances, one of which ties directly to a presentation made here in the Environmental Commission roughly a half a year ago, and that is a lighting/dark skies ordinance. So we've gathered several other ordinances. They range from 1 page to 44 pages. So we would like to end up something with a lot closer to 1 than 44. So we're going to be looking at that in the subcommittee in the current probably months. But we hope to bring something back as a draft to the commission for us to look at it, and we would share that obviously with other commissions as well, planning, et cetera, with the hope that maybe we might have an ordinance in place in 6 months or a year or something like that. And the other thing that we're working on is an ordinance that would, it may not have to take the form of an ordinance, but our objective is to get an energy efficiency measure for home listings. So at the time of marketing, you would be able to see, the US government actually has a pretty simple method to develop a energy efficiency score that is quite accurate. You don't actually have to do all kinds of detailed measurements. And that score would then be established by an audit, a simple audit, and that would then be used to, or reflected in the MLS listing so that the buyer would know. And also the idea is that the owner then would be incentivized to address any significant gaps before the house or piece of property is put on the market. So those are the things that we're working on in the subcommittees. And then in our last couple of meetings, and again in the working session, we had a long discussion about climate funding. And there was a lot of questions going back and forth between commissioners and Councilman Eaton, because right now the commission and others, including the Ann Arbor Climate Partnership, have been working on program development for climate funding programs under the assumption that money would be available from the county millage rebate. And indeed, in the 2019 budget that was just passed, there is $75,000 to either do some pilot of programs or to do maybe consulting or whatever to detail some of those programs. What was interesting, and I'll just leave it as a statement, is that in the work session, Councilmember Eaton said that he would go under the assumption that the council's decision last year that 40% of the funds would be available for these programs. And I'll say that's interesting because the public position, his public position, as is the public position of several other people on council and running for council, is that that funding should be taken away and it should be used for public health purposes. So our position was, or our question was, is it worth spending the $75,000 that we have and a lot of effort to develop programs under the assumption that we're going to get $800,000 or $900,000 a year for the next 8 years, if indeed that funding doesn't get through and gets diverted to mental health or for other activities. And his direction to us was, his assumption, he said, I would assume that you would have the available funding. So we will probably explore that yet again with him to see whether that's a good assumption, because we don't want to waste time or money or resources in developing programs that simply aren't going to have funds to operate. So that's what we're working on right now.
Thanks. Anything to share from our council representatives?
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I had a short list. I keep seeming to find trees to advocate for everywhere I go. And so that was just sort of an update on some of the sidewalk projects that are going in around the city involve getting a special variance if you've got a special tree. And so that's, trees keep coming up in the way of roads and sidewalks. And so I'm trying to protect and advocate for the trees for obvious reasons, for all the good things that trees do for the environment. And even the new water rates could have an effect on people watering their trees and planting new trees and such. So trees are a theme that are integrating into various topics. And I wanted to thank John Mursky for meeting with Glenn Nelson from the mental health group. And I made an attempt to get an equal $75,000 for the mental health people and put forth a budget amendment, but that did fail through the budget process. But I want to thank Commissioner Mursky for taking the time to work with the mental health people and hammer some of that out. And I also wanted to reference your memo from June 11, where you were recommending the framework and the dashboard and some more of those things. Maybe you'll revisit that at tonight's meeting. And just lastly, I may have a group in Ward 1 who might want to apply for some of our micro grants.
Great.
What, pardon me?
I said, great.
Yes, yes. Their community garden, it's not on public land, it's on a condominium land. But they had reached out for assistance with their garden. They mainly just wanted to borrow city tools to help plant it. But I will be following up on that, so we may see an application from the North Side Crossings condo group. And that was about it, unless anyone had any questions for me.
Can I piggyback on that, just again, for anybody that is in the audience or might be watching? What you talked about with this micro grant program, there's $100,000 in, actually in this year's budget, which is ending just in a few days, but then also in next year's budget for these, what are called Sustaining Ann Arbor Together neighborhood grant programs. If the money is unused, then it's going to probably be used for some other purpose. So what we're encouraging people to do is look for opportunities to do something that enhances their neighborhood, typically in some kind of environmental way, but it potentially could be others. There's a website on the city, I think it's, if you Google Sustaining Ann Arbor, you get to this program, and there's an application there, there's guidelines. So we encourage neighborhood groups and other groups, could be a house of worship or others, to get together and develop a proposal. And I forwarded the commissioners today an article that appeared in the Michigan Daily describing the first such grant and the work that's being done on a composting pilot to increase composting rates. That is, if successful, potentially then could be rolled out citywide.
Councilmember Smith, did you have anything?
No, I was just going to kind of ask Mr. Mursky, for those people watching at home, to talk maybe a little bit about this first pilot program, who's doing it, what the grant award was, to hopefully stimulate some ideas for people watching at home, because, you know, while $100,000 isn't a ton of money, it's not chump change either, particularly for the neighborhood projects, whether it's a community garden, whether it's
Rain garden.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of ideas, and this group in particular came forward with a really interesting and innovative project that maybe you could talk just for a couple minutes about.
Sure. There are two groups that are the primary groups. One is the interfaith, what's the name of the group that's there on Hill Street?
ICPJ.
Yeah, ICPJ, Interfaith Coalition for Peace and Justice, right? And then there's also some other senior group that have been interested in trying to do environmental related work, also that ties to climate action. The idea came up of putting stickers on the various carts that we have. So the only cart right now that has a sticker in the waste stream carts that we use are the recycling carts. There's nothing on the garbage cart, and there's nothing on the composting cart that says what you can put in those carts. So the idea was to get essentially what is like a bumper sticker and clean the carts and apply those to carts. Accompany that with flyers that went in all the carts so that when people wheeled them back, there was a little flyer saying, hey, we're going to be putting stickers on your carts. You have an opportunity to increase your composting, in particular by composting food waste, because right now estimates are, at least nationwide, that approximately 20% of what goes to landfill is food waste that generates methane gases, and it's a wasted resource because it can be composted. So the group has taken one route in Ward 5, I believe it is, and they took account of carts. They also got a discount on carts, so carts are being sold to residents at a discount, and if need be, delivered also for, I believe it's $25. And so we have a significant number of new carts that were sold, and we're hoping that we also get a significant increase in compostables, whether it's food waste or others, and that would then hopefully help increase our diversion rate. And we've talked about it here. The diversion rate, unfortunately, is a lot lower in the city than what we thought it was. It had been publicized as being 46% roughly, and it's closer to roughly 27% citywide. We should be getting an update on that from the city, hopefully for our next meeting. So that's what they're doing. Their total grant application was for $9,000, and they're using a lot of volunteer labor through these groups. And I worked quite a bit with them through the application process, and they're doing a fantastic job. And I think if you read the article, you'll get a lot more detail than what I just passed on right now. And the whole idea, again, and thanks Chip, is that we take a lot of ideas like that and get people engaged and help make our city a better city.
Do you know if they are using any of the city plans that were done? Like, do they have access to the organics pilot proposals or the plans?
I know they reviewed them, but to what degree anything directly in those plans was taken into consideration when they developed their proposal, I don't recall that there was a direct linkage.
It seems like there's an opportunity for the city to connect with residents there as part of the application process. If we have already done a lot of the research, rather than having them to repeat it, to make sure that's available.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that they did, I think, leverage is data on composting rates, tonnages, and things like that. And I think that came from data that the city was collecting, but it was also summarized in those organics reports. So they did, yes, they're using that. And to be honest with you, I don't recall, but there are metrics that they're trying to use to be able to judge how successful the program was. Because the hope is that it is successful, and if there is a proposal that emanates, say, from it to come back to the city and the council to spend more money for whatever purpose there might be, whether it's expanding composting year-round or more carts or discounts on carts, they wanted to be able to come to council and say, we measured this beforehand, and this is what was the metric beforehand for this route, and after doing the stickering and the post in the flyers and everything else, it went from X to Y, and A to B, and C to D. So they are collecting data, and hopefully, in fact, I sent them an email today asking when there might be data that we could then review with all the key stakeholders, whether it's the city or the commission, et cetera.
Considering that this was a community-funded grant project and that you have no idea how much might be left at the end, would it be reasonable to ask the council people here to make some sort of commitment for that funding? What might be the remainder? This seems like a $9,000 that has the potential to be very well spent were it replicated in other places in the community. And since at least there seems to be no consensus on where that money would go, and it seems that many of our efforts towards sustainability in this body are sort of shuffled aside by the time they get to council. This would be a very nice thing to be able to both promote a community initiative and also something that seems like pennies on the dollar in terms of an outreach effort for more composting.
You want to, I can address that first.
Okay.
So I guess the way that I would look at it is, because we're at the end of the fiscal year tomorrow, not having a great idea of how the financial people want to do this. I think we were really hamstrung by the fact that this program really didn't get off the ground until March. This was to my knowledge, this is the only grant application that was received this year.
It was.
And they have worked extensively to pull together their application, their research. I talked to them last summer to talk about, some of the things that we are interested in learning from them. So, I think I'd love to say that there's gonna be $191,000 in next year's budget, but I can't say that. And I think, for us to make budget amendments is an 8-vote item. And I don't know that there would necessarily be broader support to carry that over. And frankly, I'm not sure what the mechanics of how that gets carried over would be. And to me, that's the issue, is if we can just carry it over and have some projects in the pipeline, then that can be funded that way. But otherwise, I think it just goes, it is a number that gets wiped into our general fund reserves.
Any other comments? Okay, next on the agenda is a report from staff. Emily, do you have anything?
Sure. So since I don't have a name tag, I'm Emily Drennan. I'm a community sustainability analyst for the city. And Matt Nod is in Northern California right now and will be back for next month. Quick update, the DT Mishcon site that Commissioner Mursky mentioned earlier is beginning public engagement. We will keep the Environmental Commission updated as remediation strategies are proposed for the site. They'll be pretty extensive. Wanted to highlight some of the work we're doing with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. We've been working in a collective action group on green procurement. And with the help from the Ecology Center, we're working on implementing a green purchasing policy. So that's in the works. Commissioner Mursky mentioned the time of marketing energy audits. So we're working on that also through a USDN group. We're working on possibly increasing our energy efficiency standards for rentals. 50% of folks in Ann Arbor live in rental units. And so if we can increase energy efficiency standards in our rental housing inspections, that could go a long way to improving standard of living as well as improving the environment. We're working possibly with DTE to leverage their free home energy consultation services. And this might be a pilot offering first. It's not clear. We're working on another collective action group on 100% renewable goals for municipal energy use. And we had our first meeting this week. Something that I've been personally involved with is pulling together Equity Foundation's training. It's also through USDN, and it's focused on racial equity as a lens to all kinds of other equity issues. We're coming up on session 3 out of 5, and there's a possibility of one member of our group attending a deeper training in October and developing an equity plan for how the millage funds are spent. Let's see. There's an EV strategy plan that's in the works. We had an intern working on it for the past couple months and is in revisions right now.
That's for the green fleets policy?
It's for green fleets, but it's also EV strategy citywide. Specifically also looking at the VW settlement funds and having a plan in place in case some funds come our way. Josh wanted me to pass along that the streetlight settlement that a group called Maui negotiated with the MPSC is saving us about $50,000 a month. So that's a new MPSC ruling that just got implemented. So that's some good news fiscally. So there's a webinar that I just came across my email today for community water savings in the summer for commercial. So contact me if you're interested, because we had talked about that in a previous meeting. So if you're interested, drop me a line and I'll get you that link. Josh also wanted me to pass along that the Honeywell audits are under review by building staff. So we're going to see what of the recommendations are possible. Let's see. In your packet, there is a summary of resident options regarding concerns about pesticide and herbicide use in Ann Arbor. And this was specifically, Commissioner Mursky had asked about that in an email today, and Matt had this already drafted up from a couple years ago. So that should give you some more information about sort of what's possible and what the state precludes us from doing. But Matt did want me to offer that we could give a presentation from the city about our own personal pesticide use and how we do that. So if that is something of interest from commission, apparently this comes up every 3 or 4 years. So it's about the right time for this to come up, and would be happy to make that happen. Missy Stultz will be starting in the new business strategy manager role. She'll be starting in a couple weeks, and we're going to have the new Office of Sustainability and Innovation will be implemented as of her start date. Staff is moving around. We're moving from systems planning to the city administrator's office, so lots of changes afoot for staff.
And that's July 16th?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Missy is a former member of the Environment.
She is, you're right. Good point. And then I just also wanted to give an update on Michigan Saves. We've been doing a lot of work with them lately, a lot of groundwork, and we're looking at things both short-term and long-term. So they've given us some flyers that we've handed out at Green Fair and other events that were focused on business, residential, and multifamily. We're looking at getting a particular flyer together from Michigan Saves that covers their financial options for energy efficiency, but also renewables, because that's been of interest. And we're looking at possibly getting that into water bills, and then also using it in email, tabling events, that kind of thing. The other main thing we're looking at doing short-term is scheduling with the Ann Arbor Public Library for the late summer to early fall. We're going to have hopefully 5 sessions that are going to target homeowners. We're also going to hope to invite, Michigan Saves would be a presenter, as well as folks from County Weatherization, DT, and hopefully a couple energy commissioners to provide some other background information. Longer term, we're looking at possibly using time of marketing with the home energy score, like Commissioner Mursky was talking about. Working with Michigan Saves and DT rebate programs in the multifamily sector. DT has a new multifamily audit tool for rental inspections that we're going to be testing out, I think next week or the week after that. The possibility of starting with a voluntary program and then looking to make it as part of code. And then using an equity lens to look at ALICE group, which is, I'm not going to be able to remember the acronym, but it's basically folks that are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. I actually figured it out. So, bully for me. That's the group that is, makes too much for county weatherization, which is a pretty low threshold, but doesn't make enough to do regular loans through Michigan Save, so it's a donut hole. And that, I believe, is our staff update.
Great, thank you. Any questions?
The question and the email that I sent today to just a few people about pesticide applications, like on residential lawns and in general, that was prompted, as I mentioned in the email, by a long stream of messages posted on Nextdoor for the Nextdoor that I belong to. Would it be possible, or should I check with Matt first, if I somehow posted this? I don't know if someone's gonna read this much information, but maybe an excerpt of it, or a link to this. Is that possible, do you think?
I
Or
don't
should I check
see
with
why,
him?
I mean, he made it public to you all, so
Yeah,
I'd be happy to email it to you, and then
Okay.
you can pull out whatever you'd like.
Okay, that'd be great.
Sure.
May I add one last thing? I had sent out an email about whether it would be possible for the commission to meet at 5 o'clock on the 23rd, and it sounds like for most people that will work. I know there are a couple of people who are unable to do it, but hopefully you could relay your questions to us as a group, and we'll make sure that we introduce those into the conversation. And you and I can talk about how to actually make that happen.
Great.
So that would be a meeting with Aptum
Correct.
and with staff
Correct.
on the solid waste plan update.
Right. It's Eid that week, which is why City Council is meeting Thursday rather than Monday.
So the 23rd of August.
Yeah, I was to it first.
Thanks for pointing that out, Councilmember Bannister. I was absolutely in the dark.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any items to put on our next meeting agenda? All right. Anyone in the audience like to make closing public comment?
Yeah, hi. Hello, my name is Stephen Brown. I just have two comments, really. The first is I was one of the volunteers to help with the ICPJ project. I thought it was a great opportunity. You know, the truck drivers were also collecting, you know, recycling waste, solid waste and compost at the time. We had great interactions with them, as well as a lot of the neighbors were coming and going. So I think it was a great opportunity for people to get to know each other as citizens of Ann Arbor, and that it really is this kind of thing is a great opportunity for the city to leverage its resources, to be able to collect data for a sustainability plan, and to just do basic functions like this in terms of informing other citizens about whatever is of interest. So I would just like to point that out, especially to the council members present. And the second comment I had was that I've also volunteered for the Huron River Watershed Council, and I think it's, I like their 12 metrics. These are not independent variables. They're all somewhat interdependent with each other. And the reason that they have been doing the insect surveys, the invertebrate surveys, is because they're an especially sensitive indicator of stream health. So I think that should be considered when people start talking about weighting different factors to see what the effects are. But the most important comment I wanted to make is just that I don't see any error bars around any of these. So the first thing to do is just to see how reproducible these numbers are when different people make their judgments on the same observation, and just to make sure that we don't be making decisions based on random errors that change from year to year. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Oh, I had a question and a comment sort of for that speaker. We had mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that Veronica, Commissioner, is resigning. And I'm aware that we have at least 3 folks in the queue already, including Professor Brown. So could someone refresh my memory on what our steps are now? What happens now with Veronica's seat and the other folks in the applications in the queue?
So I would generally defer to Matt's experience with the commission, but since he's not here, I'll kind of jump in. At least the way that it had been handled in the past when there was a vacancy is when it was Councilmember Briere and I doing this, we would generally review the applications that we had. We would talk. Generally, the chair will have seen those applications as well to get a good idea of who's applied, what their skill set is, what they're bringing to the table. Because I think ultimately we're looking for a diversity of skill set here. And I think ultimately that's at least what has driven all of the nominations that have come forward since then. There's only been a couple since I've been on council. I'm open to having any kind of discussion. If everybody wants to participate in that discussion, I don't think that having a broader discussion is a bad thing. I think the one thing I'm a little bit hesitant about is talking about pros and cons of different individuals who have applied publicly. I think that perhaps if the chair can kind of share the material with everybody, everybody can communicate back to the chair, and they can provide, Bob can provide that information to you and I, because ultimately it's a council appointment, it's not a mayoral appointment. So the resolution will come from you and I. And then council, then it's just like a mayoral. We would make the recommendation, and then our colleagues would evaluate that for 2 weeks, and then we would vote on it.
Can I just add something to that? I mean, it was really nice to have John's application in there because we don't have anyone on the commission who has a strong social sciences background, and he obviously does. And so I think that's one thing to take into consideration, but also to look at the things that we're going to need to be working on. And to me, the biggest thing that we have been working on and that we're going to continue to work on is solid waste. And so if we're able to find somebody who has that kind of expertise that's really useful to the commission, I would really appreciate that consideration among council members as well.
I mean, I think some of it is just, who can do some of the work, and at least been as an observer of city business for as long as I've been, the commissions that work best are the ones that have members that are willing to put in some work to get stuff done, whether it's not just coming to meetings, but it's like, it's doing the work that staff can't do.
Anything else? Okay, then we are adjourned at 8:28. Thanks, everyone.